So coming out of X-Men 97, episode number 4, I have seen a lot of people asking me about the Onslaught saga, because truth to tell, the way that episode ended, and slight spoilers here, it very much gives the trappings that when everybody gets back to the present day, the Onslaught saga is going to kick off, which if that's true, it's going to be amazing because the Onslaught saga is one of the best storylines in Marvel Comics, and Onslaught himself is ridiculously overpowered. So let's break this down like a fraction. This video is geared more towards new fans, but if you're a existing fan and need a bit of a refresher, this is going to help you as well. So the Onslaught saga actually comes out of two storylines in Marvel Comics. The first storyline, and probably the most important contributor to the Onslaught saga, was a story called Fatal Attraction. You saw that in X-Men 97 season 1. That's the storyline where Magneto rips the adamantium out of Wolverine's body. Xavier lashes out and shuts his mind down. The second storyline that it comes out of is the Age of Apocalypse. It's not an overly significant contributor to the Onslaught saga. It really more just kind of gives us a frame of mind of Xavier when the Onslaught saga starts. The Legion quests and Age of Apocalypse storylines, those were stories where Xavier's son Legion, who's astronomically powerful, decided to go back into the past and destroy Magneto before Xavier formed the X-Men and before Magneto ended up becoming the villain that we know him to be. The rationale being that it would just make life easier on Xavier. The problem was that Xavier jumped in the way, and when that happened, Apocalypse made his move and seized control of North America. So that kicked off the Age of Apocalypse storyline. But once all that comes to an end, the only real holdover from these two things is Nate Gray, who we'll talk about, as well as the idea that when Xavier had shut down the mind of Magneto, that consciousness of Magneto basically entered into the mind of Xavier and just kind of stayed dormant. But this went into a story called X-Men Prime, and specifically it focused on a guy named Dennis Hogan. Now, Dennis Hogan was not like a super significant person out there. Instead, he was just a mutant who realized that he had powers and had learned that Westchester was a place where mutants could go, and it was effectively a safe haven where they could learn to use their powers. So like the Xavier Institute, essentially. On his way there, he's attacked, he's chased down. Xavier picks up on this and then tries to rescue him or tries to get there in time. Ultimately, David is attacked and killed. And by the time Xavier gets there, his psychic presence basically communicates with Dennis and experiences all the pain of Dennis's initial attack before he dies. That experience, combined with things that had happened over the years, the inability of Xavier to rehabilitate Sabretooth, which was a major plot point for his character leading up to the storyline, combined with just the general idea that humans just didn't really seem to want to coexist with mutants, it led to all of that frustration merging with Magneto's consciousness, right? His hatred towards humanity. And that's when Onslaught was born. Now, Onslaught does not immediately pop up in Marvel Comics. It's one of the cool things about the storyline. He actually kind of plays a little bit of guerrilla warfare tactics, appearing here and there, that kind of thing. But at this point, at the beginning of the story, he was anchored to Xavier, meaning he still existed in the mind of Charles Xavier. And in fact, the relationship between Xavier and Onslaught is very similar to dissociative identity disorder, or a better example, Bruce Banner and the Hulk in the early days, in the sense that like Banner would black out when the Incredible Hulk manifested, and the Incredible Hulk would seemingly black out when Banner manifested. So neither one knew what the other was doing. That has long since changed over the years in Marvel, but that's how it was with Xavier and Onslaught. When Onslaught was running the show and doing whatever it was that he was doing, Xavier wouldn't know what was happening. And when Xavier was in control, Onslaught actually did seem to know what was happening, just kind of hiding behind the scenes. But when he does first appear, he shows up to Jean Grey. And the overall goal of Onslaught in the beginning is to basically unite the mutant population and wipe out the human population. That motivation does change as the story progresses. But that's why when he shows up to Jean, he initially starts taunting her, right? Talking to her about the idea that human beings will never want to coexist with the mutant population, showing her these individuals in high-profile political positions. Something that I do want to point out as well, while a lot of you guys probably do remember Operation Zero Tolerance from X-Men 97 season 1, this story was a precursor to it, meaning at the time this story was written, Bastion was running around doing his thing. So it's kind of cool to see how these stories all intertwine, both in the comics and even in the TV show with X-Men 97. But the point is, showing her these instances of humans who just don't want to coexist with the mutant population didn't quite have the effect that Onslaught was looking for, and there were two reasons for this. The first was that even in the face of all of this, Jean's response was, just because people don't agree with your cause does not mean your cause is not just. So it made sense in that way, right? Xavier's literally calling for a peaceful coexistence of humans and mutants. Why would you have a problem with that? But the second reason is that because of the first, she was undeterred. In her mind, because it was a just cause, all this meant, as far as the evidence she was being shown, was that these are people who were just living in the past or just unable to move forward with their ideologies or whatever the case happened to be. And so that's when Onslaught turned the tables on her. And instead of making her question humanity and the dream of Xavier, he made her question Xavier himself. And this was actually a big revelation in Marvel Comics at the time. It was the reveal that in the very early days of the X-Men, when Jean had first been brought onto the team, Xavier was in love with her. Now, of course, Xavier ended up making himself forget that that was the case, but this was kind of huge because what it meant was that in essence, Xavier had on some level ulterior motives. And that was the bigger point that Onslaught was trying to make, that everybody out there has ulterior motives and that the only thing the X-Men really can do is abandon the quest of Xavier and seemingly embrace the quest of Magneto. But of course, Jean Grey didn't necessarily buy into this hook, line, and sinker. And so all that happens is that she's sent back psychically, and then Onslaught quite literally brands his name onto her mind, like the name Onslaught. And so at that point, you end up picking up with Juggernaut. Now, the cool thing about Juggernaut is that his appearance in the Onslaught saga comes by way of him being punched across the country by Onslaught and landing at the cabin of Psylocke and Warren Worthington, who at this point are touching naughty bits. When he shows up here, he tries to tell them the identity of Onslaught, but there's a mental block in place preventing him from doing that. And so that's when he basically ends up taking off to go meet the X-Men, but specifically Jean Grey. A little bit of a fight does ensue. I mean, why wouldn't it? Anytime Juggernaut ever shows up on the grounds of the Xavier Institute, it's usually to fight the X-Men. He had technically started turning over a new leaf at this point in time, but with Kane Marco, you never quite know, right? The guy's hatred for Xavier is a special kind of special. And so the X-Men end up uniting to face off against him, but he incapacitates them quite readily, as you would expect with Juggernaut. And that's when he meets with Jean. And in fact, he disarms himself insofar as he offers no resistance whatsoever. And in fact, he even takes off his helmet, which is something that Juggernaut never does unless he's looking to actually have a conversation to demonstrate the fact that he's not really approaching as an enemy. And he tells Jean that what he needs her to do is to scan his mind and to basically figure out who the actual identity of Onslaught is so they can learn, because he cannot tell them, right? Get past the mental block. And that's exactly what she does. She ends up learning that Onslaught is Professor Xavier. And the initial speculation at the outset is that because of the events of Fatal Attractions, that Magneto's mindset, his consciousness potentially, is slowly beginning to take over Xavier to where he is becoming Magneto in a lot of ways. But once Jean figures out what's happening and she unites the X-Men, when she shows up alongside the rest of the team to confront Xavier, by that point in time, Onslaught's hold is absolutely supreme. Xavier is only Xavier insofar as his physical appearance. His mind now belongs to the Onslaught entity. And so when everything is revealed here, Onslaught launches an attack against the X-Men, immobilizes all of them on the spot, including Jean, who's one of the most powerful telepaths at that point in time, and goes to take off. And so that switches over to Avengers issue number 400 and Nate Grey. Now, this may feel like it comes out of left field, but I promise it is incredibly important. This is one of those elements from the Age of Apocalypse that kind of holds over and transitions into the Onslaught saga. As most anybody who's familiar with Marvel Comics will tell you, it has long since been an aspect of the Marvel Universe that if Cyclops and Jean Grey ever had a child, that child would be astronomically powerful. And the villain Mr. Sinister has always been trying to initiate a coupling between the two, long before we found out the main reason why, outside of just the fact that he could take the child and use the child to destroy Apocalypse, because Sinister hates Apocalypse. There is a whole motivation behind that. That's an explanation that would best be served with regards to a discussion on Sinister. But for Nate Grey himself, in the Age of Apocalypse storyline, Sinister had taken the DNA of both Cyclops and Jean and manufactured a child, that child was Nate. So he's effectively an alternate reality version of Cable. The difference is that he's everything Cable could be if he was not infected with the techno-organic virus and then some. It's the most extremely powerful version of Cable that has ever existed in any universe across the multiverse. But when the Age of Apocalypse came to an end, Nate Gray actually survived the collapse of that reality and showed up in the main Marvel universe, kind of traveling around trying to get the lay of the land. When everything started popping off with Xavier becoming Onslaught, there came a point when Nate Gray became aware that Xavier was Onslaught. And given the incredible level of his powers, telepathy, telekinesis, reality warping in more recent years, he figured it out pretty fast. He ends up traveling to the Avengers, and that's when he meets with Captain America and all those guys and tells them that Xavier has basically gone crazy. And so in effect, he's leading the Avengers on a mission to confront Xavier. Not only that, a kind of third element to this story is that Apocalypse reemerges. The idea being that Apocalypse meets with the Watcher and realizes that because the Watcher is currently present watching all these events unfold, this is an event of significance. Now, Apocalypse didn't need the Watcher to be there to understand that, but it helped. Right? So what this does, or at least all these plot threads, start to come to a head, that the Avengers and the X-Men come together, they're joined by X-Force, and all three groups basically start trying to figure out a way to destroy Onslaught. At the same time, Onslaught himself, in launching these campaigns, travels to visit the Fantastic Four. Now, at this point, the Fantastic Four don't know what's going on. They don't know that Xavier is Onslaught. A lot of this is because of the fact that, number one, the story had to be told somehow, and number two, because the Fantastic Four, being the first family in Marvel, truth to tell, even at this point in time, coming out of the work of Walt Simonson, they didn't really pay much attention to what was going on in the rest of the Marvel universe. They were always kind of like doing their own thing out there in the world and even in the multiverse, depending on what stories were being told. And so when Onslaught shows up here, he doesn't show up as Onslaught. He shows up as Xavier, because at this point in time in Marvel Comics, Franklin Richards was still classified as a mutant. And what Xavier did is he pitched to the Fantastic Four the notion that the relationship between humans and mutants is starting to become far more stressed and tenuous than it used to be. And so it's in the best interest of Franklin to travel to the Xavier Institute, learn how to use his powers, and to be among his own kind. As you can imagine, the Fantastic Four immediately shot this down. They said no. And that's when Xavier manifests into Onslaught and launches an attack and dominates the Fantastic Four. It's not even close. I mean, they never had a chance in the first place. Although I will say it was dope to see Reed Richards just kind of like swell up to like this muscle-bound guy. Dude looked like Jay Cutler. It was crazy. But the point is, because Onslaught's able to dominate them, and because Franklin is so young and doesn't fully grasp everything that's going on, all he really believes is that he's going to go to the Xavier Institute, and that's effectively it. But this allowed Onslaught to essentially absorb Franklin Richards into himself, which would give Onslaught the ability to tap into Franklin Richards' powers. Following this, Onslaught, who'd already traveled to a Sentinel factory and basically reprogrammed the Sentinels to follow his commands, ends up launching an attack in Manhattan. The idea being that the Sentinels start attacking different smaller superheroes around that landscape. I wouldn't define Spider-Man as being smaller, but Spider-Man was not a major focal point of the story, mostly because of the fact that at the end of the day, the Onslaught saga was an X-universe centric story. So while the Avengers were there, they were only really there because of X-Man Nate Gray, although they do become a major focal point of the story. But the other reason why Spider-Man was not overly involved in it was because of the purpose that the Onslaught saga served, which we'll talk about once we get towards the end of it. But between guys like Spider-Man, Punisher, and so on, they're effectively kind of pushed out of the story for the most part. And so by the time everything starts to come to a head a second time, Onslaught, using Sentinels, has effectively built a kind of fortification system around Manhattan to where nobody gets in and nobody gets out. And so with Onslaught, while he is in possession of Franklin Richards, meaning he's absorbed Franklin, Onslaught cannot force Franklin to use his powers. Franklin has to willingly do it. Now, some of this is just narrative, but some of it's also because of how powerful Franklin is. Franklin, historically speaking, for those of you guys who don't know about him, is like Gohan from Dragon Ball, right? You get these like small moments here and there where his power just swells up to astronomical levels and then disappears just as fast. These are instances of him like aging himself up into an adult, destroying Mephisto, Galactus is terrified of him, different things like that. This is another one of those instances where because Franklin is so powerful, Onslaught cannot force him to use his abilities. What Onslaught does instead is that while all this is taking place regarding Franklin within the mindscape of Onslaught, Onslaught manifests a childlike persona that can relate to Franklin on a very personal level and convince Franklin to ally himself with Onslaught's philosophies. But Charlie, who's the name of the childlike entity, does this by way of telling Franklin things like, hey, you want your family and friends to be safe, right? Onslaught can do that. He can make it so everybody can be safe. All you have to do is let him use your powers. The problem with this is that it doesn't work perfectly, that Onslaught is not able to attain all of Franklin's powers. And the reason why is because while Xavier himself isn't really the one, quote unquote, driving the ship anymore, right? The Onslaught entity is the one that's in control of everything now. Xavier's mind is still present. And so Xavier kind of works to combat the influence of Onslaught, reassuring Franklin, Onslaught is not a good guy. Do not let him use all of your powers, that sort of thing. The other thing that happens is that while Franklin is incredibly powerful, Onslaught also seeks the powers of Nate Gray. And so Onslaught quite literally hoodwinks him. He opens a kind of portal and then just, a child extends his hand. And then Nate Gray, not fully understanding that this is Onslaught, ends up reaching in and is pulled into the portal by Onslaught and then absorbed by Onslaught. So now Onslaught's got the power of all three people. He's got Xavier's abilities, Franklin's abilities, and Nate Gray's abilities, albeit not all of Franklin's powers. And that's when you end up learning what the main motivation of Onslaught is here, which is to essentially take the consciousness of all the humans, mutants, and everybody on Earth and just combine them into a singular gestalt entity, which Onslaught can feed on and then transition to a higher plane of existence, right out into the universe and most likely go after the cosmic entities themselves. The story for the most part doesn't really explore that. It doesn't explore the idea of what Onslaught would do to the Marvel Universe as a whole, what would happen when he comes across like Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet or something along those lines. Instead, it's very much an Earthbound story. But again, while all this is taking place in Manhattan, Apocalypse and the Watcher are monitoring it all. And Apocalypse keeps talking about how this is the precipice of a new age of Apocalypse, because what he's doing is essentially biding his time. He's waiting for the perfect opportunity to step in, intervene, seize control, and then take Onslaught's power for himself, and then effectively take over the world. And so what he ends up doing is presenting himself as an ally to the Avengers, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four, who at this point are now unifying in order to, again, try to defeat Onslaught and Manhattan. Cable doesn't trust him, nor would he. Cable never trusts Apocalypse. And in fact, a fight does break out between the two of them. Susan Storm steps in, using an invisible shield, and separates the two of them, and then forces Cable to acknowledge the fact that while Apocalypse is presenting the idea of going into the Onslaught entity and then rescuing Franklin and Nate Gray, that the only way to successfully free Franklin is for Cable to put his anger and hatred of Apocalypse aside and to be willing to work with him, which is exactly what Cable does. So they end up entering into the mind of Onslaught to try to rescue Franklin, and that's when Apocalypse makes his move. The idea being that he wants to take Franklin as his new host. The irony behind all this is that even Susan Storm didn't really trust Apocalypse. She didn't really think he was actually doing anything for the benefit of anyone other than himself. And so when Apocalypse goes to make his move, Susan appears, and you end up finding out she had followed them in while making herself invisible. Now, I do think that's an important distinction to understand. Susan Storm was able to hide her presence using her powers from the Onslaught entity, because while Cable was hiding both himself and Apocalypse, they didn't know Susan was there. So that's one of the coolest things about this. And so in the midst of this, Susan tries to rescue Franklin, but isn't successful. And so that's when they realize that because they can't get Franklin out, the only thing left to them is to destroy Onslaught and hope they can rescue Franklin and Nate in the process. I will also specify during this time, Xavier's mind was literally pulled out of Onslaught. So Xavier was kind of reverted back to his normal self, just operating out in the real world. And so by this point, the powers of Onslaught have been reduced slightly, but not really enough to make him any less of a credible threat than he was before, right? If the baseline powers of everybody who's here exist at 25, just using a random number, and Onslaught was at, 90 when he had Xavier, Franklin, and Nate Gray. With Xavier's mind being removed, Onslaught is at like 75, right? Still more than enough to destroy everybody here. I'm not really power scaling, we're just using random numbers here, but the reality is that with Xavier among their ranks now and able to provide a level of insight into how powerful Onslaught really is beyond what everybody else generally understood, it becomes quite clear that the Avengers, X-Men, and the Fantastic Four cannot do this on their own. So they end up reaching out to any and everybody they can find, which includes Doctor Doom and the Incredible Hulk. And at that point, they jump into a physical fight with Onslaught. And again, it doesn't do any good. And so while they're all quite literally being readily handled by the Onslaught entity, the Incredible Hulk comes up with a plan. He talks to Jean Grey and he tells her the only way to be able to defeat Onslaught physically is to have someone that can match Onslaught's incredible levels of durability and physical strength. Now, something that I want to specify here, specifically regarding the Incredible Hulk, while technically earlier in the story, he had been targeted by Onslaught and was being controlled by the entity in order to destroy whatever superheroes he could come across, Cable and Storm were able to free the Incredible Hulk from Onslaught's control. But more so than that, up until this point in time, the Incredible Hulk had been Professor Hulk. Marvel was looking to undo this. And that's the reason why when he pitches the idea to Jean Grey, she removes the Banner persona, really kind of shuts it down more than anything else, which reverts the Incredible Hulk back into his savage form. So it was effectively undoing the Professor Hulk concept, and his alter just disappeared and wasn't seen for a number of years in Marvel. So in effect, resetting the Hulk back to the status quo. This leads to the Hulk running up on Onslaught, a physical fight breaking out between the two of them, and the Incredible Hulk cracking his armor. Now, it was not enough to destroy Onslaught, but it was enough for Onslaught to be able to essentially move beyond a physical form and become a being of pure psychic energy. What was really interesting was that at the time his armor was cracked, basically it fell to the ground, and the belief was that the Incredible Hulk had destroyed Onslaught, quite literally punching him to death. But when it's revealed that Onslaught is an actual energy form now, because it cannot be physically attacked, the only other line of logic was for basically the Avengers and the Fantastic Four to jump into Onslaught, literally overload the entity's energy and destroy it, which is exactly what happened. Now, this goes into the discussion of why the Onslaught saga was created in the first place, because at this point in time, as most people know, Marvel was struggling financially. What Marvel was basically doing here with this storyline was launching an initiative called Heroes Reborn. Because what happens is that with the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, quote unquote, dying in order to destroy Onslaught, which essentially they do, Franklin Richards resurrects them from the dead and then puts them into a little pocket reality called the Heroes Reborn universe. It's the blue bowling ball that he carries around with him. That goes on for quite some time until he's forced to bring them back in Heroes Return. Heroes Reborn was dope, but that's why all of this happened in the first place. Now, I do want to point out here, in X-Men 97 Season 2, it's very unlikely that you're going to see a one-to-one adaptation of all of this. I doubt you'll see Nate Gray, because again, he's an alternate reality of Cable from the Age of Apocalypse, and we have not been given the Age of Apocalypse yet in X-Men 97. I don't know that you're going to see Franklin Richards, because truthfully, we've got, 6 episodes left until the series ends, and it feels like if they were to throw him in, it would just be done out of nowhere as opposed to a natural build up to it. And so you'll likely see some modified variant of this. Most likely it'll probably come down to Rachel Summers. Quite literally. I think she'll end up being the person that kind of steps in and helps to bring everything to an end. But again, it's kind of hard to know. I'm excited to find out though. But with that being said, guys, that's the story of Onslaught as you'll see him in X-Men 97 to some degree. There are future versions of Onslaught. He has returned historically over the years. None of his returns have ever been on the same level of significance as the original Onslaught saga. There were things like Axis when you got Red Onslaught. So basically when the Red Skull got his hands on Xavier's brain and then morphed into Onslaught during that storyline. But again, none of them really on the same level as the original. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.